Hi, and welcome to Bloody Good Reads. I'm your host, Mark Goddard. So this week's guest is an actor and a writer, and his brand new book, The Nestlings, is coming out on Halloween. What a great time to have a new book out. Welcome to the podcast this week, Nat Cassidy.
Hello, it's lovely to be here.
Welcome to the podcast. And again, like we said off mic for UK listeners, not Natalie Cassidy.
No, we are very different. I wish I had her career.
You don't.
We were talking about it off mic how differently she and I are treated by our respective countries' presses, and I don't envy her that. Sometimes I'll get Google search or like Google alerts for articles about her, and yeah, oof. Sometimes it's quite cruel.
She's not writing horror. Anyway. So welcome to the podcast. What we like to do here on Bloody Good Reads is force authors to pick 3 books they love, because I am a bastard. But before we get to that point, and before we get into the amazing brand new book, what I like to ask all my guests is, how did you get into the horror genre?
Man, how do I answer this question concisely? I probably won't. I'll probably go on a bit, so bear with me, everybody. Anyone who's listened to a podcast with me before knows I can monologue, so strap in. I don't know. I've been a horror obsessive for as long as I've been conscious, I think. Like I was raised by a single mom who also was a big genre fan. She loved sci-fi, she loved horror. So there were horror books around all the time. I have very early memories of her watching horror movies when I was probably too young to be witnessing them. And I would have a very, very early memory of her watching Alien when I was a little kid. And I saw a glimpse of it and it, freaked me out. And then I went to bed and couldn't sleep, was totally terrified, and very clearly remember getting out of bed and walking back to the living room and telling her, I need to watch the end of this movie with you because I need to know how this thing dies. I guess I had enough storytelling wherewithal to know that there would be some sort of ending. But like she was very good about that. She was very good about being like, okay, if you need to see the end of this movie, like, sit down and watch it. We'll figure out how to kill this alien together. And I was also a very I guess nowadays you would call it a hyperactive kid. I was really just more of a little shit, and would be very disruptive in class and lighting fires and etching things with a knife point in the desk and stuff like that. But teachers learned very early on that if they were talking about anything ghost related or spooky related, I would actually pay attention. So the example of that is in first grade. My first grade teacher, who fucking hated me and I fucking hated her, Mrs. Shapiro, and she was showing a slide presentation. She was Greek, from Greece, and she was showing a slide presentation of her last trip back to Greece, and there was an amphitheater in one of the slides, and for whatever reason, she was telling this group of first graders about how she saw a production of Macbeth at this amphitheater. And she started talking about the plot of Macbeth and noticed, to her credit, how I sat up straight and I started listening to, regicide and ghosts and witches and all that stuff, and challenged me to read Macbeth as a first grader. As my put up or shut up, I think I'm so smart, I think I'm so funny and interesting. And I took her up on it because there was no way I was going to let her have the final word. And I spent that entire year reading Macbeth with my mom. And that kickstarted my lifelong obsession with Shakespeare and classical theater. And so even from that very early age, tales of ghosts and goblins and horrible decisions and tragedy and stuff like that was just an intimate, immediate hook for me. And I've discussed in various other media some of my hypotheses as to why. I think some of it is because some of it was just this way to connect with my mom because it was a thing that she loved. Some of it I think is just intrinsic, because my brother is not a huge horror fan. He loves sci-fi, but he's not a huge horror fan. So some of it I think I'm just hardwired that way. And I think some of it too, as I grew older and became more of a conscious creature, My mom, who again was a single mom raising 2 kids, she had MS. She had a progressive disease that we were all aware of very early on, how it was like, slowly stripping her for parts and making life harder and harder and harder. And she personally had to process what it was like to be a very individualistic person, very stubborn, and she didn't like to put up with shit, but she was watching her individuality and her ability to kind of be on her own and to do things by herself slowly sap away. So it was this very existentially terrifying experience for her that took a long, long time. And I started to appreciate how her fandom of genre and horror in particular helped her process that. And I kind of, it helped me process that too, to witness the losing of my mother over the many years and stuff like that. And we're also I always forget if it's second or third generation, but her mom, my grandmother, emigrated from Poland in 1929, and we're Jewish, and we had a lot of family that was not able to escape the Holocaust. And my mom was, in particular, obsessed with the Holocaust and questions of genocide and things like that, and this sort of general feeling of not being safe as a Jewish person that I think is also kind of culturally wired into us. And I think also used horror as a way to process that, and taught me how to use horror to kind of process those feelings as well. This is a very heavy thing to just jump into at the beginning of a podcast to answer this question, but I think it all feeds into why horror is such an important thing to me. Like, horror is one of my biggest passions as a reader, as a movie-going person, as a TV-going person, as a creative. All my plays are horror. All my books are horror. It's just kind of the lens through which I process what it means to be alive. And I think these early childhood memories and these kind of early filters through which I was processing these big fucking heavy concepts like mortality and like progressive illness and like genocide and all these cultural identity and just all of these things. I think they all found facilitation through my love of horror. And through my love of the genre that tells stories about how things can go real bad, and sometimes things can go even worse than they will ever go for you. And sometimes you can win, sometimes you can't. But you get these like digestible little stories to help you process that. Yeah, so that's my attempt at a long-winded answer.
But,
Good night, everybody.
But I think that's how a lot of us get into horror through kind of a parent. My mum was always a huge horror fan.
Yeah.
That's how kind of it's the reason why Scream 2 is one of my favorite films. I just remember that as being one of the films we watched together when I was younger, and the kind of the horror reading as well. We always we had like boot sales, car boot sales here in the UK, which is like yard sales in the States. Used to always get books all the time young, when I was younger. And my nan was also hugely into kind of Native American history, kind of witchcraft and ghosts and that kind of thing. So I've always been brought up in that area as well. So I'm the only one in my family who's actually really deeply into horror. So I don't know, but but you're kind of getting into kind of Shakespeare and kind of theatre. Is that kind of what made you want to get into acting in the end?
Yeah, absolutely. I was a precocious little child actor, so I've been acting since around that time, since around first grade, since I was like 6 or so, doing like local theater and regional theater and stuff like that. And I was always it was always in the with the goal of doing primarily Shakespeare. Like classical theater was just my obsession for the longest time, and I love contemporary theater and stuff like that too, and did at the time, but I was such a little fucking snob and just like only cared about the classics. And I grew up in the late 80s and then the early 90s, and so this was when was a very weird pocket of time that I feel like most people have kind of forgotten about. But it was, the rise of like Merchant Ivory movies and Kenneth Branagh movies and stuff like that.
Mm.
Like you could go just like see them in the theater, like they were just there. So like I saw Henry V and I saw Much Ado and I saw his Hamlet, all 100 interminable hours of it. And it was just like part of the pop culture at the time of like, oh, Shakespeare and classical theater and again with like the Merchant Ivory adaptations and E.M. Forster and just all these like classical stodgy beautiful white British adaptations of beautiful in the landscape, not because they were white, but they were oppressively white. But just like that vibe, that '90s Merchant Ivory vibe, was super popular when I was kind of becoming aware as a pop culture consumer, and I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with these stories and with the sweep of the narratives, and especially for me, I love and have always loved about Shakespeare how violent and how funny and bloody and twisted all these plays are. And so I just became obsessed with pursuing that as a career, and went to college for that. I got a degree in classical theater. Essentially, my degree is technically in acting and directing, but I was the Shakespeare guy in my university, and then moved to New York basically to pursue that. And then it took like 2 or 3 years of professionally pursuing a career in classical acting when I realized like, oh, I actually fucking hate classical theater. And like it's a scene that I don't enjoy. I still love the works, and I love the when productions are good or interesting, I really love them like no other. But there's a classist vibe to it, and there's an inflexibility to a lot of people who love classical theater in a similar intensity. And you do the same 37 38 plays over and over again too, and that starts to be really boring after a while. Like, God, I've done Midsummer 5 times, I've done Hamlet 5 times, I've done As You Like It 4 times. Like, it's just eventually you're like, I've got it. Like, I want something new.
We'll take a new kind of look at that same story, but in
Yeah,
a totally different way. In the '90s,
yeah,
was very big for that. It's Shakespeare in Love. You had Romeo and Juliet. It was mid '90s as well.
right, yeah.
So yeah,
And that Hamlet with Ethan Hawke, which I
yeah.
hated at the time, but has grown on me because it's interesting and new.
Mm.
Yeah, one of the best plays I've ever seen was a black box theater production of Macbeth in like 2007. And they like Pulp Fictioned it. They just like cut up the text and did it in a completely, it wasn't random to them. They had a very clear vision of how they wanted to do it. But to an audience, it almost felt like it was this random reorganization of the scenes from it. And it was fucking fascinating. It was so great. It made me fall in love with that play all over again. But yeah, so like I just kind of drifted away from wanting to pursue classical theater as an actor, as a career, around that time, and started just kind of getting a hunger for like writing my own stuff and writing new stories and kind of contributing to a new canon as opposed to this old established, as we've already as we've already said, just like oppressively white and like just kind of monocultural canon that feels like it can take some time off. Like a lot of these plays, I'm like, yeah, we can put those to bed for a little while. Yeah, I don't know if that answer made sense, but yes, that the acting and the Shakespeare are all very very intertwined from a very early age.
Then you went into a little bit of TV work after that. You've been in some good shows. I mean, Blue Bloods, Ball, Quantico. The following goes a little bit more crime horror, but
Yeah.
there's some great shows on your list of accolades.
Yeah, I love doing TV. TV is like my favorite genre or medium, I should say, my favorite medium overall. Like I love writing for TV and breaking stories for TV. I love acting for TV. As you've just pointed out, I have a little cottage industry of playing dirtbags and monsters in. I jokingly refer to them as your parents' favorite shows. Because they're all like the crime procedurals. I've basically done a bad guy on each one. Your Law and Orders, your Bull, Blue Blood, Quantico, FBI. You name it. I've been a piece of shit on all of them. A monster of the week, as it were. But I love it. I love TV. I love acting for TV. Yeah, I love contemporary acting in general too, because it's just it's different muscles. But there'll always be a part of me that wants to go back to using my classical theater voice and getting to have a page and a half long soliloquy where I talk about the futility of life in beautiful iambic pentameter. So they scratch different itches.
Yeah. Cool. Well, before we get into the writing side of things, what we like to do here on Bloody Good Reads is force authors to pick 3 books they love. So what's your first Bloody Good Read?
I want to echo that you are an absolute atrocious bastard for this, because I'm a Libra. Not only am I like an obsessive reader, but I'm a Libra, so I'm like constitutionally predisposed to not be able to pick things, and so this was fucking torture. And I'm probably going to change the list as we talk. I have my little list, and then I have like 3 or 4 books under them, so I'll either change my pick or I'll find a way to fit more than one book into my picks, because this was fucking brutal.
To be fair, you wouldn't be the first person to do that.
Oh, good. It's a noble tradition. Yeah, this was hard. This assignment was not easy. My first one, then, I decided to just fucking punt and pick what has often been my like favorite book of all time, or what I like to describe as my favorite book of all time, which again is a boilerplate choice because it's safe and easy for me, even though sometimes it's not always accurate. But I decided to go with Ghost Story by Peter Straub because I fucking love that book. I'm still very sad that he passed away last year. Like, that's still very very fresh, and I love recommending it to people and pushing it on people. So it seems like a good first choice to go with. It's also a good choice for someone who has a hard time making choices, I think, because it's such a polyphonic book. There's so many stories within this book. It is for those that don't know, it is a novel. It is one story, but it's a story about telling stories. So you get a ton of little stories within it. It's about a group of old men in a snowy little town in upstate New York called Millburn, and they get together and tell a ghost story. I think it's every month, if I remember correctly. And they're all in their 70s and 80s, and they've been doing this for a long time. They have been nicknamed the Chowder Society by one of their long-suffering wives. And they like to, each member has to tell a story for their particular meeting. And as they are telling each other these stories to try and scare them, bits of these stories start coming true, and they start to realize that there is an event in their past that they have not dealt with, that they've been repressing. And, there's all these other subplots and other characters. It is a kind of quintessential late 70s horror novel, because it's just got this massive scope. It's this big, epic book that some could say is probably longer than it needs to be. But it actually is like delightful because of its scope, because of its magnitude and its different subplots and stuff like that. And Peter Straub is just such a brilliant writer, like a brilliant prosmith. His prose is just gorgeous, and he's very sly and funny too. He never got the accolades as a funny writer that I feel like he deserved. And so there's just all these dry, wry little bits. And all the characters are named after, one of the major characters' last name is Hawthorne, another is James, and they're very purposefully echoing Nathaniel Hawthorne or M.R. James, and those styles of Gothic ghost storytelling. And eventually things just get really phantasmagoric and really strange and nutty and trippy, and yeah, it's just such a we're recording this in the middle of October, so people might be listening to this, in the colder months, depending on when they decide to put it in their ears. So if it's like November or December by the time you're hearing this, it's the perfect book for that time. It's just this cold, snowy, bleak little rampage through these old men's lives in this tiny town in upstate New York, and it's fucking great. It's called Ghost Story for a reason, because it's the ultimate ghost story. It's almost every ghost story you could imagine in one place. So I love it.
Good choice. I've not read any Peter Straub yet, though.
Oh yeah,
I need to get on that.
yeah. He is. I mean, he's fucking great, and he has his Stephen King connection, which I feel like is how a lot of people come to him, because they co-wrote The Talisman and Black House together, which are great. They're phenomenal books.
I do own Black House, weirdly.
What's that?
I do own Black House, actually.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I love Black House is one of my like dark horse favorites of both of them, and I've read everything Stephen King has ever published and then some. Like I'm a Stephen King obsession, and very few people consider Black House to be one of his best. But like I love it. There's something so weird about that book, and they're an interesting pairing because like Stephen King is he's down home Maine, very very Americana, very folksy voice, and was known at the time too for all his like American brand names, and he's the Big Mac and fries of American literature. And Peter Straub, who's also American, but he spent a lot of years in London, and has this like much more British aesthetic. Like he loves that kind of gothic literature. And Stephen King is all about like AC/DC and American metal, like pop metal of the 70s and 80s, and Straub's all about like jazz, and he's very refined, and they're just like such an interesting collision of voices. But I forget where I was going with that, but they make a great pairing. Just that Straub is a great exemplar of that era of horror fiction that also gave us Stephen King and gave us Ramsey Campbell and Robert McCammon and that and even Clive Barker, who's slightly the next generation. So he like embodies the stuff that we love about that era so well, but also rejects a lot of it in really interesting ways. Like he's got this other book, Floating Dragon, that came out before Stephen King's It, but is kind of a dry run at It. It's got a lot of very interesting similarities, but you can tell it's Peter Straub making fun of 80s horror. Like it's so over the top. It's so just like thumbing his nose at the garishness of the genre by that point. But it still winds up being really good because he's a really talented writer. And he's got the books that came before Ghost Story, like Julia and If You Could See Me Now, are very restrained and very gothic, and like creepy and wonderful. And he's great. I sometimes I feel like it was a shame that he got as famous as he did because of Stephen King. So people looking for Stephen King can maybe find him a little too intellectual or a little too obscure or hard to get into, but he's full of rewards. Like he's just such a great writer. And if you also write, I've found this to be very true. I would imagine other people do too, but you tend to write better when you are reading Peter Straub. Like there's just something about his voice that to crib a Shakespeare quote about Falstaff, he's not only a good writer, but he's the cause of good writing in others. Like he just kind of inspires your voice in really interesting ways. So I love him.
Awesome. Good first pick, and I've got a lot to catch up on. So what we'll do is we'll get into your writing career. If you go into the films, what were the kind of books? Obviously, we know you read a lot of Shakespeare and was into kind of the theatre side. What kind of books did you read growing up?
I read Stephen King was and like still probably remains like my North Star. Like I am very grateful that I came of age when I did, because I didn't have that many Stephen King books to catch up on, and then I just got to read each new one as they came out. I can only imagine what it's like now to like try and catch up on Stephen King. But I obsessively read and reread everything of his from probably like 1989 on. Pet Sematary was my first, and just was obsessed. And then I read anything that he recommended, which was how I first learned about Peter Straub. Ghost Story was my first Peter Straub because of Stephen King's recommendations. I mean, it's interesting. We're already kind of dipping our toe in Shakespeare a little bit, but my mom had a hard and fast rule with me. She put me on a diet, essentially, because we didn't have any money. We were super broke. She was a single mom, and she could only work part-time because of her MS. So me and my brother were being raised on a single parent part-time income. So mostly we relied on libraries for books and stuff like that. And I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and at the time Phoenix was nowhere near as well developed as it is now. So I didn't grow up on like the wrong side of the tracks, but I kind of grew up on the tracks, and like in one direction it was just like desert. And then in the other direction it was like a leather shop and a strip mall and a few things, and it was like a 20-minute drive to get to my school district. I lived very far away from everybody that I knew and all my friends and stuff like that. So there just wasn't much around, and it's Phoenix, Arizona, so it was just unbearably hot for about half of the year. So you tried to stay inside all day. But there was a library basically in our backyard, like a kind of 5-minute walk from us. So I would just spend all my time at the library. And my mom was like, "You're reading too much horror. So here's the deal. You can read whatever you want horror-wise, but for every horror book you check out, you have to also get a classic." And she didn't quite, specify what classic meant, but it just had to be, something of repute, I guess. So she already knew that I was obsessed with Shakespeare and reading Shakespeare kind of passionately by that age. But it kind of put me on this interesting dual path of like, for every Clive Barker I would check out from the library, I would have to get like a Jane Austen, or I would have to get a Dostoevsky or something like that. And so I grew up just loving classic literature as well. Nowhere near as much as Shakespeare. Like Shakespeare and Stephen King were like the two tracks that I would go down. But I read a lot of like Shakespeare scholarship and a lot of like, Hazlitt and pompous windbag Bloom and A.C. Bradley and these big Shakespeare scholars and stuff like that, which kind of made me fall in love with literary theory and boring stuff like that. And I became a big Russian fan, so I love Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. And like Lewis Carroll and again Jane Austen and George Eliot and just all these I'm being redundant here, but all these classic authors, and it was a great little it was a great regiment to be on as a young reader, and also as someone who liked to bend the rules as much as I could. It was great to like try and find whatever were the most like horrific things I could that were still considered classics. So I got to read things like Johnny Got His Gun and things like that, and just all these like horrifying books that weren't considered horror, but were even Crime and Punishment. The fucking murder scene in that is just horrifying. And so I got to try and figure out what books were kind of both, and those were always my favorite books. So that's kind of what I grew up reading. It was very it was a diverse slate of books, and could probably give you whiplash, but I'm very grateful for it.
Okay. So when did the love of writing come about? So I'm assuming acting was your first love. So
yeah, totally.
How did you get into wanting to be a writer?
It probably speaks to my precociousness and my latent narcissism. But I started writing probably around like 8 or 9, uh, and I started writing because I thought it would be fun to star in the movie adaptations of my inevitable bestsellers. Uh, and which is weird. Like I very clearly remember that being my thought process because I was like, I want to be an actor, and so like, why don't I just? And I had a pen name for my books, and I was like, I'll just star in the adaptations of my books that I'm going to write. But I never wrote books about like someone of my type. So like I wasn't writing about like little 8-year-old kids. So I don't know why I made that connection. But that was my intent when I first got into writing. Um, but I fell in love with it really hard. Like they definitely became, twin disciplines that I started pursuing. And I would write, as you can imagine, just like complete Stephen King apery. I was just
Mhm.
constantly copying him. My book that came out last year, Mary, um, has in the foreword and the afterword, I talk about this a little bit, so some people might be familiar with this. But I first wrote Mary when I was like 13, and that version, which was not very good. It was, only like 100 pages, and it was, horribly written and plotted out and stuff like that. It was just kind of the concept has carried forth from that original attempt. But even that book, that came out now, the Mary that exists, is about a woman who goes home to her the small town in the middle of Arizona, in this desert town that she grew up in. And the desert is very important and is, a big part of the plot and all that stuff. But the version that I wrote when I was 13, of course, she lives in Maine. And it's just this story about a woman in Maine, because I thought all horror stories had to be set in Maine. And I don't know shit about Maine. I've never been to Maine, still to this day. Closest I've been is New Hampshire. But like every story I wrote had to be set in Maine because, of course, Stephen King sets his stuff in Maine, so I will write in Maine. Um, and yeah, so it was stuff like that, and like
Yeah.
uh, I will say the one drawback of being raised on like classic literature is I wanted to have a very literate voice as an author. So I was trying to, marry the like folksiness of Stephen King with, what I thought was good writing.
Mhm.
And so most of the stuff I was writing at that age is just absolutely unreadable, and just every polysyllabic word you can imagine just crammed in there, trying to make it sound flowery.
Mhm.
Um, it was just absolutely pathetic. These were the early days of like a computer word processor too. So I had my like Word Perfect word processor, and it had an automatic thesaurus function. And I would just like fucking ride that Shift F7, just like trying to find the synonym for a word, and it would be like 5 synonyms removed of what the original word was supposed to be by the end. Um, and yeah, so but I would always carry around with me an accordion folder that was stuffed with story ideas and the beginnings of short stories and whatever stories I managed to finish before I got distracted by another idea. Um, and yeah, they kind of, it was interesting to have a pen name for my stories as a kid, and be pursuing acting, because it almost started to feel like two separate identities.
Mm.
And they kind of grew up separately. And it wasn't until my 20s, it wasn't until again, like when I moved to New York and I started pursuing classical theater and realized that I didn't enjoy it. It was only then that I realized, oh, I could write plays. I've been doing plays my entire life. Been, like raised doing theater and writing my own original, stories and stuff like that. But it did not occur to me until my like mid 20s that I could marry those two disciplines and start writing for the theater. And at that point, my playwriting career took off faster than my acting career, and I kind of shifted my focus to being a full time playwright, and then acting for TV and stuff like that. because there's a lot of downtime between TV gigs. Um, and yeah, they are now no longer like separate identities, but I found it kind of silly how long it took me to realize that I could join those disciplines into one.
Well, let's move to Mary, because it was very, very well reviewed. You've got people like Hayley Piper, Brian Keane, Eric LaRocca all giving it absolutely amazing praise. And you praised as well for actually being able to write a female character very well, which seems to be very controversial at the moment, especially within the horror genre.
Yeah, right.
Let's not go too far into that conversation. But oh, Twitter. But no, I mean, it seems to have been given amazing reviews, and especially from kind of female readers as well, on how you have done the Mary characters. Where did the idea for the book come about?
Yeah, thank you, by the way, for that kind introduction to it. Yeah, that book, I'm very grateful for all those amazing writers and their blurbs, for sure. That book was a weird journey. It's about the kind of elevator pitch of it is that it's a menopausal version of Carrie. So it is, yeah, very much from this one woman's POV, and it's written in first person present tense POV. So we're in her head as she's experiencing life as someone going through menopause, or perimenopause, to be more specific. And like I said earlier, like I first wrote that book when I was like 13. And that was the concept. I wanted to write a book that was like Carrie, but for a woman going through menopause. And I've been asked many times why a 13-year-old wanted to write about menopause, and I don't know how satisfying my answer is, but basically it was because I was going through puberty at the time, and I loved Carrie, and I love how Carrie kind of functions as a metaphor for puberty and menstruation and all that stuff that has been discussed at length. So I kind of, again, in my Stephen King apiary, wanted to find a way to do my own version of that. And I was like, well, what's the other big hormonal and physiological rite of passage that people go through? It's the other side of puberty. It's menopause. And so that's kind of where that idea came from. And part of it, I'm sure, is that my mom maybe would have been going through the earliest stages of perimenopause, and she was very frank, and we had a very close relationship. So maybe she was talking about what she was going through at the time too, and that fed my interest. Both of my parents, I was raised by my mom, and I would see my dad like twice a month for an overnight. But both my parents were in the medical profession, so there were medical textbooks all over the place, and I would read those too. I was very obsessed and fascinated by anatomy and physiology. So that probably also fed into this sort of lifelong fascination with how the physical realities of our lives affect our inner life and affect our perception of life and things like that. So all of which is to say that's probably where that idea, that's the stew from which that idea kind of generated. Wanting to write a story about someone going through something physical and seeing how that affected the story and their experience of it. But as I've also said, that earlier version of it was garbage. It had no insight into human existence whatsoever because it was written by a 13-year-old. But I never let that idea go, and I would like come back to it every now and then as the years rolled on. And I write a lot, and I write a lot of stories. So it was not that like I had a lack of ideas. It was just that like this character and this premise kept coming back to me, and like wouldn't leave me alone. So when I finally sat down to write it properly, I would have been in my late 30s. I was like 38, 39 when I wrote it, and very much a cisgendered male, and very much aware of writing about a lived experience that was not something I have been through. And uh, aware of the controversy that could stoke, because um, yeah, Twitter is an interesting place, and sometimes things uh, uh,
It's
get
been very prominent as of late.
yeah, and things can get very heated, and I don't want to go into the validity,
No,
because I think
yeah,
there's definitely validity of like people writing about a lived experience that they don't know about and doing it wrongly,
yeah.
and then there's the other side that, like, writers should write what calls to them.
Yeah, there's
And
rights and wrongs on both sides of the
yeah,
spectrum.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And the best way that I kind of can square that circle, as it were, is to, if you are going to write about something that is not from your perspective or from your lived experience, is to just be as respectful of it as you can, and make sure you are not making assumptions, and making sure that you are uh, for me personally, I had a lot of beta readers and a lot of sensitivity readers, and just wanted to make sure that if I was exposing my asshole to the world, that I was covering it up as best I could, or at least acknowledging when I was being ignorant, or being told by readers when I wasn't aware that I was being ignorant, and
Mhm.
just trying to address it as best as I could. Because I mean, um, it's fascinating. And this probably also comes from being an actor too, because it's your whole job as an actor to put yourself in somebody else's experience,
Mm.
and sometimes you are playing someone who has a completely different given circumstance than you do, and just trying to be as authentic and honorable as you can in that portrayal. And I love research as an actor too, and I love learning more about something that maybe I didn't know about going into it. So I'm incredibly grateful for all my sensitivity readers and beta readers and feedback and stuff like that, and they made that book so much richer and better than it is. And you know, as you've so graciously said, like, the response to Mary has been, for the most part, very wonderful, and just very gratifying. And so many people who have been through menopause, who have said, like, wow, this really spoke to me in a very authentic way, or I think you captured authentically what it is like to live as a cisgendered woman in this world, and especially a woman of a certain age. There's been a lot of responses like that, and at the same time, there've definitely been reviews from people that are like, this reads like it was a book written by a man thinking about what it means to be a woman, and like, or this book
Mhm.
suffers from written by a man-itis. And eventually you get to a place where uh you just have to do the best you can, and try and make sure that you are doing all the work that you can
Mhm.
to be respectful to the source material. And ultimately it's going to work for who it's going to work for, and it's not going to work for who it's not going to work for.
And you can't
um,
please everybody.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm really, again, gratified to hear from all the people that it did work for. And the people that it didn't work for is, okay, that was their experience of the book. And
Mhm.
thanks for your time, and I hope you like the next one.
Yeah.
Uh, and the next one, Nestlings, also is about, it's about postpartum, and it's about paraplegia, and it's about a lot of things that I once again have not had firsthand experience from. Like, it's about some things that I've had very much secondhand experience of, and it's about things that for some of the other characters that I have had very much firsthand experiences with. Uh, but once again, like, I went into it making sure I was speaking to people who have dealt with paraplegia, and speaking with neurologists, and speaking with people who that one of the main characters uses a wheelchair. So I wanted to make sure that I was portraying that as authentically as I could.
Mm.
And yeah, I think for the most part, if you go into something with as good intentions as you can, and just uh, um, I'm I'm blanking on the very common phrase that I use all the time for some reason, that I was going for, um, uh, but ultimately it comes down to just good intentions, and
Mm.
I keep wanting to say good humor, and that is not the word I am looking for. But yeah, just honoring it, and being being respectful.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we get into the brand new book, we're going to go into a second choice. So what is your second bloody good read?
My second bloody good read is I'm going to go with a book called West of the Sea by an author named Stephanie Willing. And this is a weird book for me to go into. This is a weird book for me to recommend. And it's maybe a weird book for this podcast because it is a middle grade book written for young audiences. But
We've had many of these on there, don't worry.
oh, yeah. And this is not horror. It is not a horror novel at all. It is cryptid, and it is maybe, I guess you could call it like sort of fantasy, but it's not fantasy. It's set in our world. But this is a book by a dear friend of mine. We are in a writers group together, where it's just her, me, and two other writers. We all come from the theater world. We all did a bunch of plays together. Stephanie is a dancer and an actor, and has been in a bunch of plays that I've written. And we've done a bunch of horror plays together, which is hilarious because she's. I don't think she likes horror very much. She definitely doesn't watch it on her own, or read it on her own. But and it comes from like a very conservative background where I don't think she was exposed to much horror. So it's hilarious to me that I've made her do some incredibly atrocious things on stage. And she's very good at it. But as a writer, this is her debut novel. It came out a couple of months ago, and it's this really beautiful, lovely story about a young girl whose mom is dealing with, I'm going to put it through her perspective, so this is not actually accurate ultimately, but her mom is dealing with what seems just like horrible depression and withdraws from herself and her family. And this girl, the protagonist, Haven, is just so desperate to understand why her mom is this way, and like isn't sure if she's responsible for it or if she can make it better. And it's really causing a lot of tumult in their tiny little family. It's the mom, dad, and Haven and her older sister. And then one day her mom up and disappears, and she's terrified that her mom has either done something to hurt herself or something has happened. There was this strange incident the night before her mom disappears where she came into Haven's bedroom, and for a second it looked like she wasn't human. And then she was nowhere to be found the next day. And so Haven basically goes on a road trip to try and find her, and starts to experience these strange things herself, where she realizes that maybe she is not normal either. She's not quite human either, while she's on this road trip looking for her mom. And so it's just this beautiful story of self-discovery and proactivity in the face of helplessness, and dealing with a parent who has mental illness. And Stephanie's a very humane and charming writer, so there's a lot of fun to be had in it too. And one of the reasons why I wanted to recommend it to people too is because if you're listening to this episode because you know my work and you've read Mary or something like that, this book, West of the Sea, was developed in this writers group at the same time as Mary. And it's fascinating to see, like, the author of Mary, of this like gnarly, very gory, ghosty horror fucking roller coaster ride, was reading the pages of West of the Sea and giving like feedback and suggestion on like, oh, here's how you can make this moment pop better. And the author of West of the Sea, this beautiful, humane, middle grade road trip novel, was reading chapters of Mary over and over again, being like, oh, here's how you can make this more gnarly and more disgusting and stuff like that. And it's just so funny how writers work together and collaborate and stuff like that. Like, you would not think that Stephanie and I would have much in common as writers, but like we really do, and we have very complementary voices and stuff like that. And she helped make Mary and Nestlings, my next one, and every other book I've brought into this writers group, so much better And I like to think that I probably have added moments of darkness to her stuff, or have made the darkness pop a little bit more. And yeah, so I feel like, they're very different reading experiences, but it's very funny to read West of the Sea, which is a beautiful book in and of its own right, and people should read it anyway, even if they don't give a shit about my back catalog. But if you do get a kick out of Mary, it'll be a little extra bonus enjoyment to read this like weird cousin of Mary and of Nestlings. And if you do like stories of mothers and daughters that are very similar to West of the Sea, one of the other books I was going to recommend is Erica Worth's White Horse, which is a beautiful indigenous ghost story about a daughter who's haunted by the ghost of the mother that she didn't really know, and is trying to figure out why. And that is a fucking fantastic book too, that you should definitely read. And Rachel Harrison's newest book, Black Sheep, is about mothers and daughters as well, and it is really fantastic. So there's some 2 under the wire recommendations that I almost put for this slot.
A couple of honourable mentions.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. No, we've had some amazing YAs on the podcast before, some amazing YA authors as well. So I'm always happy to have some YA authors on.
Yeah, and it's like no less. The stakes are just as high, and they can be just as like terrifying and enthralling as adult fiction. It's just like there's less curse words,
and you get some amazing kind of fantasy,
yeah,
books in that kind of genre as well.
Yeah, the imagination is so fucking great of them. So yeah, I love YA. I think more people should read that as an adult audience.
Also, it's a great way of kind of transitioning into kind of adult horror as well, because some of the YA stuff is pretty dark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my god, it is.
Awesome. Right. So your brand new book, The Nestlings, is out on Halloween.
It is.
It's coming out through Tor?
It is, yeah, through Nightfire.
Yes. Yeah, through Tor Nightfire. Our good friends over at Tor Nightfire. We do a lot of amazing authors coming from Tor recently. Chuck Wendig has said Nestlings are so fucking good it makes him mad. And it is Paste Magazine's most anticipated horror book of 2023. So tell us a little bit about the brand new book and the inspiration behind it.
Totally. Yeah. It is the elevator pitch is it's basically Rosemary's Baby meets Salem's Lot. It is because of course, if my first book is going to echo Carrie, my second book is going to echo Salem's Lot. It's about a young couple, Anna and Reed, who have an almost 1-year-old daughter, and they live in New York, and they've just had like a run of absolute atrocious luck. The story is set like right now, so they've made it through New York in the pandemic, which was its own like absolute nightmare. And the economic fallout of that, how it's affected their jobs and their livelihood. Reed's mom just died. He's stuck in a day job that he absolutely detests. And they're raising a newborn, so it's got all those challenges. Their landlord is a racist piece of shit. They're Jewish, and he's very anti-Semitic, and that makes them very unsettled and nervous. But worst of all, the birth of their daughter had some horrific complications, and there was like a 1,000,000,000 to 1 injury that got exacerbated during the labor, and so now Anna is paralyzed from the waist down and has to use a wheelchair. And she's someone who was incredibly physically active. She was a former dancer and a physical trainer. And so she's finding herself, with none of her coping mechanisms. She's dealing with postpartum depression. It's just this. She's dealing with like post-injury depression. It's horrible. It's a horrible situation. Reed is, finding himself being a caretaker, and he's not very well emotionally equipped for those sort of duties either. And so it just really feels like their luck has run out and they're just hanging by a fucking thread. And then out of the blue, their name is pulled in this affordable housing lottery for a luxury apartment building just right off of Central Park West, and just one of those famous New York buildings that you dream of living in. That it's full of movie stars and famous musicians and other famous people, and it's the architecture is stunning and the location is incredible. And they entered this housing lottery as a joke like 10 years ago, because everybody enters this housing lottery. Nobody gets one of these apartments. There's just this one floor of affordable housing units that everybody wants, and so it starts to seem like maybe their luck has turned, and maybe things are going to start getting better. And Anna is a little hesitant because this apartment is on the top floor. And, as someone who uses a wheelchair, she's like, what if there's a fire? What if there's an emergency? What if the elevator breaks down? Like, this is kind of a tricky situation. But they decide ultimately, you know what, fuck it. We're not going to turn down good luck. We're going to embrace our fortunes when we get them. And so they move into this building, and nothing bad happens, and everything is great, and they have a great life, and that's the end. Until you get to chapter 2. And then the horror novel kicks in, and I'll leave it there to not spoil it. But yeah, I very much wanted to write if Mary is like a first person phantasmagoric unreliable narrator sort of romp, this is very much like my homage to 70s and early 80s like potboiler paranoia sort of thrillers. There's a lot of, it's not a vampire novel, but it is kind of vampire adjacent as I've described it. And it's very much written from a Jewish perspective. As I've said, I'm Jewish, and like I've always been fascinated by vampire stories and other stories that are kind of like from a kind of de facto Christian sort of lens. And most classic vampire stories are sort of rooted in this Christian supremacy that I think a lot of people aren't even aware of sometimes. And you'll see some like more modern vampire stories be like, it's not the cross, it's the belief behind the cross. So like any holy artifact will work as long as you believe in it, or something like that. But a lot of like the really classical vampire stories are just like, yeah, a cross and holy water, like that'll do it. And as a Jewish reader and lover of horror, like there's always this feeling of like, what does that mean? What am I supposed to take from that? What would I do if I were in that situation? And so I just always wanted to write a vampire story where the protagonists are Jewish and are wrestling with those sort of implications. And so it kind of comes from that as well. And I was writing this book in like 2021, 2022. And it's set in New York. It's very much a New York novel. And New York is very much a Jewish city. It's one of the like highest concentrations of a Jewish population in the world. So like I knew that it was going to also, that was going to be an intrinsic part of it, the Judaism of New York and what it's like to be a secular Jew in New York and in America. But as I was writing this book, the kind of climate of which is never at zero, but it was starting to get really intense. And so ultimately it also just became about like what it's like to be Jewish in America right now, and these feelings of isolation and cultural alienation and cultural homelessness and not quite belonging anywhere, and things like that, especially when you're like more of a secular or less observant Jew. So you don't belong with the Orthodox Jews, you don't belong with the more observant Jews, you don't belong with the non-Jewish communities in a way too. So it's just like this constant feeling of outsiderness. And so it's a very creepy and a very I think disturbing and relevant read, but also is about a lot of things that are very contemporary. It's rooted in these like classical theater, or not classical theater, but classical horror tropes, but it's about some very contemporary issues, as well as also being about like disability and ableism and the sort of pressures we put on new mothers and things like that as well.
Mm.
So yeah, I'm very excited. I'm very excited for people to read it, and I'm also very grateful for the wonderful blurbs we've had.
That is Nestlings. That is out on Halloween, and it's available in all good places you can get your books. So I need to go to the last one then. So what is your final bloody good read?
Oh, this is the one I've been. It's like it could be like one of like 9. Okay, so
How many times have you changed your mind?
oh god, within the past hour, probably like 6. But we've touched on like some heavy things and some controversial things, so I'm going to lean into my slightly more. It's not controversial at all, but we'll see how our conversation develops around it. Because I think I love nonfiction too, and I love historical stuff. And so I wanted to do a nonfiction book as well. And so I'm deciding. It's an imperfect book. There's several things about it that I don't agree with, or that I think are not as fully nuanced as they should be. But there's a lot about it too that I love. And it's a book called A Problem from Hell, by Samantha Power. The subtitle is America in the Age of Genocide. And Samantha Power is a fascinating woman. She was the UN ambassador during the Obama administration. She's an Irish immigrant, and brilliant woman. Very great writer, too. And this book is a survey, essentially, of the major genocides of the 20th century. So it starts with the Armenian genocide, and then it goes into the Holocaust, and touches on like Cambodia and Bosnia and Rwanda and a few others as well. So it's very light reading, but it's one of the reasons why I kind of disclaim it at the top just a little bit. Like I think there's a lot of value in this book, but some of it's very much from an interventionalist point of view. It's very much about the importance of the U.S. in particular intervening and getting involved in foreign affairs and in like genocidal activity and stuff like that, and to prevent it, obviously. And so that can be controversial for some people. Not everybody is. There are different shades of interventionalism. And the book kind of leaves out a lot of the atrocities that like the U.S. is responsible for as well. It's a little starry-eyed about the U.S. And its history. So it's not a perfect read. It's not, and it's a 600-page book, so it's not a short book, but like it covers a lot of history. So there's a lot of stuff that it just physically can't go into the nuances of. But it's valuable in in keeping these events alive and teaching people about these things that happened that can easily be forgotten about. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to recommend it also is that one of the things that the book does really well is it mentions a specific person who's someone I've been fascinated with for a long time, and my plays and my screenplays and stuff like that tend to either be horror or historical. And there's one of the historical ones that I've always wanted to write and still mean to write. And this would probably be a screenplay, not a play. But it's about a real person, and I've wanted to write a biopic on him for a while. So hopefully I'll get around to do it one of these days. And this book talks about him a lot, and he's a fascinating human being. His name is Raphael Lemkin, and he was a Polish lawyer who managed to escape Poland, I think like a couple of years after my grandmother did, actually, like in the early 30s. And escaped Poland, came to America, came to New York and then DC, or maybe straight to DC, and became very involved in lobbying the U.S. to be more aware of the early stages of the Holocaust, to get more involved, to try and prevent this Holocaust from happening that he was hearing from his relatives who were still in Poland, and he was trying to get to come to America, and was having a hard time with it, with getting them visas and stuff like that. So he would like become known for being this like disheveled guy who would just like run up to every congressperson he could find in the halls of Congress and just like beg them to pay attention and to get involved and stuff like that. And he, to a disconcerting extent, like he, people would like try and avoid him and stuff like that. Like he was just he was a lot to deal with. But he was desperate. He was desperate to claim or to call attention to what was going on. And he, as a lawyer, was someone who worked on uh, uh, some litigation involving the Armenian genocide. So that was he had that very much in mind as he was watching what was going on in Germany and then Poland and the areas that Germany was annexing before 1939. And what I found really interesting about him is that we talk about these things. We're like, yeah, he was trying to prevent genocide, but we forget that genocide is not a real word. Genocide is a fake word. It is a Latinate and a Greek morpheme mixed together. So it's not a word that like occurs naturally. And as Lemkin was trying to figure out how to call attention to these atrocities that were happening, he had to find a way to describe them, and there wasn't a word to use. And so he's actually the person who coined the word genocide. Eventually, he figured out like, oh, this is a good way to describe it. It's geno, I think, is Greek and is about people, and side is about trying to kill. So it's about trying to kill the people. And so he came up with this term to call attention to it. And he wound up, obviously the Holocaust then happened. I think he was unsuccessful in getting his family to escape it, so he lost a lot of like direct family members, and he died. I don't want to say disgraced. He wasn't disgraced, but like nobody attended his funeral. It was a very like unremarkable death. But he has this legacy then of he eventually had this. There's another thing I'm just going to blank on, but it wasn't a committee, but it was for all intents and purposes like the Committee on Genocide was formed because of his efforts, and it became a thing that people started paying attention to. And obviously, genocide still continued to happen, but we started to have a word for it. We started to be able to like look out for it more, and be more aware of it. And so I find his example as a human being to be very important. That like it can be so, and obviously the elephant in the room right now is the what's happening in Gaza right now, and what's happening with Israel right now is just this horrible thing. And this is why I say this is maybe a controversial thing to get into, so we don't have to get into it too deep. But obviously it's like particularly as a Jewish person, like it's this horrible feeling of like, I'm someone who very much wants Palestine to be free and to exist, and but there are other complications that I'm aware of that are making that not just a thing you can immediately do, but like and the things that happened in Israel were horrifying and atrocious and very upsetting. But now the way that Israel is reacting to it, or the Israeli government, I should say, is reacting to it, is also horrifying. And we don't want a genocide to happen because of threats of genocide. And so like I'm very much against what the Israeli government is maybe doing to try and defeat Hamas, which is a thing I very much want to happen. And, it's just this fucking push and pull. It's horrible and it's awful. And I'm very grateful to people like Raphael Lemkin for like allowing us to even, understand what is happening, have the language to describe what is happening, to try and prevent it. And I think we can feel very helpless in the face of these things as individuals, because how the fuck are you supposed to prevent a government from doing a thing when you're a single human being? And he's very much an example of how, in some ways, you can't. Like, he was unsuccessful in it, but the importance of trying and the importance of using your words to try and affect change however you can, and that there's a nobility and an importance to that. Like, sometimes all you can really do is just come up with a word, and that can be enough. Like, his coining the term genocide has helped call attention to other genocides. And Samantha Power's book talks about how, there have been some genocides that have at least been like stemmed by awareness and by interventionalism and stuff like that. So even though it's not as easy as just saying you got to get in there and stop it, sometimes it is as easy as saying like we got to get in there and like try and fucking mitigate as much as we can, because we can't allow these things to happen. So it's a very complicated subject, and I apologize for bringing this this book podcast to a screeching fucking halt. But it's very much on my mind right now for understandable reasons. And Nestlings is, let's bring it back to my book that I'm plugging. Nestlings is very much about, what it means to be Jewish in America right now, and what it means to have the legacy of the Holocaust, and also these like incredibly complicated connections to a country that, it's another country. I don't feel responsible to answer for Israel's actions. I'm a fucking American. Like, it's a separate country. I've been there. It's a really weird place, and it's a really wonderful place with wonderful people. But like, it's a very complicated thing. And so I think I would hazard to guess that other American Jews understand that feeling of like alienation and isolation and feeling like you don't belong anywhere. And that's kind of what Nestlings is about, in a lot of ways. So ultimately, this very heavy and loaded and hedging and hopefully not offensive conversation is just so I can plug people to buy my book. That's ultimately what it was all about. I don't know. Did any of that make sense? Was any of that okay?
It made sense. Don't worry. You're not the only one to pick historical non-fiction here as well. So yeah, you're fine. You're fine.
It's a good book. It's a really good book, even if you don't agree with all of the stuff. Problem from Hell is a good book. And if you want other books about genocide, one of my favorite books, it feels weird to say favorite, but We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families by Philip Gorovitch is about the Rwandan genocide. And that was one of the most important books I ever read in my life, and kind of changed how I look at the world. And I highly recommend that to people as well, because that's also a situation that, it goes into like media manipulation and how genocides are fomented, and how how cultural divisions, because there is the Hutu and the Tutsis are, for all intents and purposes, not different at all. There's no difference between them, and yet, so it's like, what is it that made them? What is it that made this genocide happen? And as my country and your country, is feeling like more and more polarized and more off the rails with its kind of internal divisions and insanity. That book was very sobering to read, of like how those can be stoked, and how these like little picayune differences can suddenly, explode into an actual genocide. So yeah, that's some more light reading that I recommend for anyone.
For an easy weekend read.
Yeah, exactly. This is why we fucking love horror, though. Is like, it's an escape in a way, but it's like an honest escape, because it's not like we're escaping into, the world is sunshine and rainbows. It's like, no, shit is still really awful and horrible, and we have to figure out how to like digest these sort of concepts. But let's add a fucking vampire into it. It'll be a little fun.
It's the reason why I listen to a lot of talk radio. There you go.
Yeah.
Gotta keep up with the news. Cool. Brilliant. So that is 3 amazing picks. An amazing brand new book coming out in October in Nestlings, and an amazing guest this week. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast this week.
Oh my God. Thank you for having me. What an easy conversation.
Well, thank you.
Easy
is there anything you are working on next that you can talk about, or are you all under hush hush?
I am. It hasn't been announced yet, but I think I can talk about it. What are they going to do? Stop me? My next book, I'm doing revisions of right now, so I'm like halfway through the next draft of that. But that is scheduled, because publishing just moves very slow. That is scheduled to come out in, I think, April of 2025, which feels forever from now. But so did Halloween of 2023, and here we are.
Right.
And yeah, super excited about that. That's kind of my the elevator pitch for that one is it's kind of like uh, It meets Terminator 2 with a
Brilliant.
dash of like the Twilight Zone and Firestarter thrown in. And it's my homage to like paperback airport horror novels. So it's just like action set piece after action set piece, and it's just kind of pedal to the metal horror and suspense, and I fucking love it. It's a lot of fun.
A
Uh,
little bit of Sean Hudson style there.
yeah, exactly. A little bit of Dean Koontz thrown in there. I think people are really going to enjoy that. And then I've got a novella that I wrote that I'm trying to figure out if I can get out next year if possible, but that might not be possible. But that's kind of like Gerald's Game meets Green Room. So it's kind of a little dabbling in extreme horror for me. Yeah. Yeah, so I got stuff coming. I mean, I'm on strike as an actor, so I'm not doing that much.
Well, there you go. Sure. Awesome. Again, a huge thank you to Nat for coming on the podcast this week. Go and check out the brand new book. I almost said Nate there. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
I would have signed off. I would have signed off in disgust.
He's gone. He's gone.
Everybody gets one. Everybody gets to do it once.
A huge thank you to Nat for coming on the podcast this week. Where can people find you if you would like to be found?
Oh, I can be found everywhere, but I've gotten worse and worse at it. I've gotten so bad. I used to be so fucking good at social media. Like I was on all of them, posting all the time, and I've kind of burned out.
So depressing though.
Oh, I know. That was like I would like think in terms of posts. It was super healthy. And yeah, so I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Blue Sky and TikTok. I've started doing more TikTok. I actually kind of enjoy TikTok a lot. So I'm like the most active there. And I'll be on the other platforms for like an hour a day at most. So it takes me a long time to respond to things, but I'm there if anyone wants to find me. And I'm still on, I think, Facebook. I still have a profile that I never look at. I think I'm still on Friendster. I think you can still find me on MySpace.
Okay.
Yeah. So any and everywhere you want to go, I'm probably there, but I don't do much.
Awesome. I'll put some links in the description below as well, and go check out the website for more information about previous works and movie and music and everything. So, a huge shout out as well to our sponsor, Abominable Book Club, as always. They're the UK's best and biggest horror and thriller book box service, bringing the wonders of a haunted bookshop straight to your door each month. You have two boxes. You have the Bare Bones box, with just one books, and because books are awesome. Or you can go for the Full Guts box, which is a brand new book, a possibly haunted second-hand book, another indie title, or a literary magazine, depending on the month. You also get UK snacks, you get UK drinks as well, you get some bookmarks, some badges. I'll always say it, the canvas bag's probably the best thing I ever got from that box. I love that canvas bag. But yeah, some amazing stuff. You get some, I think the last few, you've had books from Eric LaRocca, which was amazing. Any kind of titles from Titan seem to jump in here as well. Yeah, go and check out some of the amazing titles on our Instagram as well. And we've talked about it so many times in this podcast. We've done it for so long. We always mention them, but they've been supporting us right from the start. And you can use the code BLOODYGOODREADS at checkout to get 10% off your box as well. Also, you can catch me over on Instagram at Bloody Good Reads, on X, Twitter, whatever it's called now, at Bloody Good Reads. And we have a Facebook thing, but we don't really use it anymore. It's just people just post their stuff now. But also catch us on our monthly movie podcast as well. We've got a Christmas special. You know the guys always want to do some amazing Christmas movies that aren't horror. So I apologise for that part. And as always, I have been your host, Mike Goddard. Thank you so much for listening. Apologise for the very lack of episodes in the last month, but we are back on track with some amazing guests coming up as well. So do check us out on your podcast streams. Give us a like, subscribe, wherever you get your podcast. And as always, thank you for listening. I have been your host, Mike Goddard, and I'll see you next time.